culture-centered research deals quite a lot with the concept of spaces. When it addresses the issue of spaces, it makes note of the point that spaces are important to changes in policies and programs. Noting the intersections of the symbolic and material, culture-centered researchers point out that it is through the interpenetrating relationship of the symbolic and the material that changes can come about. In other words, the extent to which symbolic spaces are organized within the structures of power, they also play out particular material interests. Those with access to power and access to economic resources are also typically the ones that have access to the symbolic spaces where discourses are articulated. We might think of these spaces in terms of two functions, one of recognizing the agency and participatory capacity of people and their communities, and two, in terms of a politics of representation where specific issues of the margins are represented in articulating changes and transformative potentials. So one of the things we see when we address this issue of spaces is that spaces are differentially constituted in terms of who has access to them and who doesn't, as it relates to issues of representation and recognition. When we think about subaltern communities, for instance, subalternity is defined as erasures from mainstream discursive spaces. What does that mean? In a sense, what subalternity is referring to is the idea that communities that are erased, or individuals from these communities that are erased from discursive platforms, they are erased because their capacities for recognition are not articulated and engaged within dominant structures. So change comes about through the creation of entry points of recognition, where we first recognize the subaltern as an agentic entity, where we recognize subaltern communities as having agency and therefore having the capacity to make decisions, to participate, to be worthy of participating. In that sense, then, you see, recognition is also connected to the basic human capacity to want to communicate, to be heard, to have one's position and standpoint be heard in a way that it matters. Representation then builds on this idea of recognition to articulate the notion that communities that have been erased also have the right to have their voices be represented in the identification of issues as well as the frames that are created around these issues. Now, both of these concepts, representation and recognition, are tied to the broader politics of change. Because typically, when we look at issues of development, which culture-centered researchers are mostly interested in, subaltern issues are backgrounded by virtue of the roles of recognition and representation. Meaning, it is only by not recognizing the agentic capacity of subaltern communities do mainstream discursive platforms carry out particular policy formations and articulations that disenfranchise or marginalize subaltern communities. And you see, this is where the cycle sort of completes itself. In other words, by disabling the representative capacities of subaltern communities, mainstream structures carry out their politics of oppression, carry out their specific economic agendas. In that sense, therefore, culture-centered research is not only deconstructive in identifying how spaces are organized and therefore how through these processes of organizing do they carry out the erasure of specific communities, but also in a sense of being co-constructive. Culture-centered researchers are not only interested in identifying the places where the erasures happen, but then working through these erasures to finding spaces for positive transformation and positive change. The goal, therefore, for much of culture-centered work is to listen to communities, and with this idea of listening, to really first configure through the processes of listening, how can structures of listening be created. And you see, this is where, again, sort of a complex relationship is played out. Because on one hand, we talk about listening, but on the other hand, in order to be able to listen, we need to create the spaces of listening. In other words, listening is not simply an entity that we can attend to and say that, oh, we turn our ears to a community, and in doing so, we end up listening. The question that the issue of listening in the context of subalternity raises is, what are the strategies, tactics, processes that are embodied in mainstream formations of listening, and what are the ways in which these processes of listening actually listen as opposed to turning off possibilities of conversation and dialogue. Therefore, when we think about this idea of spaces, coming back to it again, the idea to keep in mind is that spaces are continually negotiated, and this negotiation of spaces can happen through a continual engagement with the politics of recognition and representation that goes back again and again to subaltern communities, not only as ways for framing issues, but more fundamentally to ask questions about what are the ways in which participatory spaces can be created that are truly enabling to subaltern voices. What are the ways in which strategies, tactics can be created that foster opportunities for participation? What are the languages, tools, devices that we create and foster that enable participation as opposed to disabling it? Also, at the same time, then, reflexivity in culture-centered processes turns the lens inward toward the dominant structures in asking the question, what are the ways in which the dominant spaces within which we are accustomed to participating turn off possibilities for participation for subaltern voices? And this continuous reflexivity can enable us with the tools to deconstruct as we seek to co-construct.